When I first started drawing diagrams, I would stare at the whiteboard, wondering how to get started. I would draw a box and then delete it. I would then draw the same box again and then delete it again. So believe me, I know how tricky it is to know where to start when building an architecture diagram. But if you remember these tips we will talk about, you will start building them like a pro. You see, a diagram might look like a bunch of boxes and arrows, but it's much more than that. Knowing what every box stands for is not enough. The diagram should convey a message. It should tell a story. Let's take this Fuji X-T20 for example. It's a camera with buttons and dials and screens put according to a layout. I can know exactly what every button does. You know, here's the shutter button. Here's how to zoom. But does knowing the function of every button makes me a photographer? Obviously no, but the way these various components are ergonomically laid out helps me pick up on the underlying message, the message of how to properly take a picture. The ergonomic layout provides context and a deeper meaning than simply labeling the button of the camera. And that same concept applies when building architecture diagrams. So before you draw your first box on the page, figure out your message. If you don't know what your message is, well, ask yourself, what is the value this diagram is providing? What is the story I'm trying to tell? Am I doing a step-by-step migration story? A lift and shift migration story, an ETL, extract, transform, load story? If you're having a hard time telling the story, try to write it down. You know, just sometimes when you try to write down an explanation of what you're trying to accomplish, and then you see written these words, well, you will have an easier time building your message. When I was learning my way to photography, the instructor on YouTube didn't explain what every number, button, dial, and handle did in the camera. That would have been overwhelming, you know, to say the least, and I would have retained nothing knowing how my brain works. Instead, they showed the necessary pieces to get comfortable with the concept of photography. As software engineers, we assume the more information, the better. And we try to pack in information in data-dense diagrams. But introducing your audience to something without the knowledge you have leaves your diagram looks like hieroglyphics. So ask yourself the following questions. Who is the intended audience of this diagram? Are they familiar with your domain? Are they a developer who understands all these technical details? And then adapt your diagram to the audience. Which brings us to the next tip. More is better than one. We're telling a story, remember. So have your first diagram setting the stage, building up context, building up common and shared understanding with your audience. But once you start presenting, you will likely get a handful of questions. How does this component interact with the main database? How will this component be secured? Where do I transform this message? And that's where your second, your third, or your fourth diagram come into play. Think of them as companion diagrams that make your story significantly more impactful and easier to understand. You can answer security questions with a specific diagram that shows the authentication mechanisms, encryption solution, data flow, and whatnot. Now, going back to the camera analogy, this is where you start learning about prime versus zoom lenses, the various focal lengths, the exposure triangle. These are not necessary for taking a picture, but you learn pretty quickly that they are needed if you want to be or become a photographer. Alright, 2 more tips to go, but before that, if you're new to the channel, hi, my name is Ilyas, nice to meet you. This channel is all about getting to the cloud and growing in the cloud, you know, career-wise, but also from an architectural point, technical point. If you like what you see, make sure to hit the subscribe and notification bell so you don't miss out on new uploads. You don't always have to start at the beginning. Now that you know your audience and the level of familiarity with your domain, you can probably skip a few components and jump ahead in your presentation so you don't bore them with stuff they already know. I'm gonna go back to my camera again. It's safe to assume that in 2022, everyone is familiar with what a JPEG is, so no need to explain that in depth. Or if you were teaching someone to drive a manual transmission, you wouldn't show them the steering wheel, gas pedal, and brake pedal if they already knew how to drive an automatic transmission. You'd focus on the clutch and you'd focus on the gear shifts. And the last one in the video is rather simple tip, but one that I rarely observe in the majority of diagrams, and that's the lack of a legend, which I think comes from, again, assuming that everyone is familiar with the boxes, with the arrows and other shapes in the diagram. But please don't fall into this trap and add a legend to your diagrams. Everyone who reads it will thank you for it. Drawing efficient, clear and concise diagrams is not a gift you have to be born with. It's something you learn. And as with everything, practice is required. But I'm hoping these tips I learned along the way will help you kickstart your diagramming career. Now, if you're curious about how a solutions architect spends their day, watch this video where I take you with me on a tour of a day in my life from the first to the last activity of the day. And if you want to learn about some of the top cloud careers in 2022, watch this one.